Welcome to the Classical Gabfest, a weekly discussion about the ever-changing world of classical music. I'm your host for this week, William White, and with me as always are Tiffany Liu and Kensho Watanabe. This week we'll be discussing a satanic organist performing in French churches and how we feel about venues sacred and secular. Then we'll open up the mailbag for some listener feedback. And finally, we'll talk about the Salieri rumor and why historical gossip matters. But first, we like to start with our Prelude segment. And our unofficial official intern Joseph is here, so you all know what that means. Joey, what do we have today?
This week we'll be playing a round of everyone's favorite game, Name That Tune, aka Stump the Hosts.
And now Free Zone presents Name That Tune.
Music games don't come any simpler and any more intimidating than Name That Tune. And this game is especially fraught for our hosts, since none of them know what they're about to hear. That's because these Name That Tune submissions come from you, our loyal listeners. So that none of them can see the submissions, I'm once again here to officiate unofficially. Today's edition of Name That Tune is going to be a bit different than usual. As listeners know by now, our Name That Tune submitters tend to proffer deliberately obscure music, spurning Beethoven's Fifth in favor of Serbian steel pan concerti, in a bid to stump the hosts, which they inevitably succeed at doing. Nonetheless, occasionally a piece by a name-brand composer slips through the cracks, and over the past couple months, I have diligently collected such submissions for today's Name That Tune.
Maximum embarrassment.
This is to say, today's submissions are all undeniably canonical composers, which I will unrigorously define as composers whose name no undergraduate classical music student can graduate without knowing. To the contestants, I offer a warning. This should in no way assure you that you will recognize the music you're about to hear, but you do know the composers, and that's all we ask for in this game.
Speaking of Satanic, this is, I think,
This is going to be so embarrassing.
So, our first canonical composer submission comes from listener Jeremy.
Oh, God.
Of course it does.
Here it is.
Weber?
I also wrote down Weber, but isn't that too obvious?
Yeah, I mean, like, I know that Weber did write, fantasies for clarinet, but, and so...
Is this clarinet or basset horn?
Oh, true.
Ooh. I think it's clarinet.
I think so.
It might be a basset clarinet, but I think there's actually only two pieces written for the basset clarinet, and both of them are by Mozart.
Okay.
Okay, what else do we have?
Well, okay, so we're agreeing that this is like
Classical-ish.
late classical,
yeah.
probably early romantic, maybe 1815 to 1840, something like that.
Sure.
You know, my thought is just that there were a lot of woodwind solo fantasies on operas at this time.
Mm-hmm.
And this could be something like that.
Which would mean what?
Oh, I don't know what it would mean. I'm just getting that out there. I mean, it could be like Donizetti, Rossini, based on their music, but I don't know if those people would have written these things, Mm-hmm. But there were those little, like, almost Till Eulenspiegel-esque moment, like right at the end.
Yeah, I was going to say, what if it's somebody who's way later?
Yeah, which it could be.
Just like writing virtuosically, because like,
right.
That language is not difficult to acquire for a certain level of instrumentalist. So is it possible that this is maybe like somebody who played the clarinet that lived several generations afterwards?
Yeah.
I'm not sure where that puts us, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is got to be in the 19th century, but I agree. It could be a later reference to an earlier style, but it's a canonic composer. I mean, like, it could be like Offenbach.
Mm-hmm. There were these like weird or interesting turns in the harmony that I wasn't
Mm-hmm.
quite expecting from something that's like Weber per se. You know what I mean? Like it was a little bit more quirky. Yeah.
Quirky is a great word. Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned Strauss, Will, which is like not a terrible, like out
Yeah.
there kind of like obviously somebody that we know who could write this if he wanted to.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Richard Strauss. I could see that being. I don't know. I'd like to pursue the French route a little bit.
I mean, take Saint-Saëns, for example,
I will take Saint-Saëns, for example.
who, manages to develop a language, but has essentially traditional values in doing so.
I think this is like too fun for Saint-Saëns, even in his youth. But I like it as a guess. I mean, do we want to... What if we said Saint-Saëns, Strauss, and Offenbach?
Are we locking it in?
Okay, let's do it.
With regard to Offenbach, these are canonical composers.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
should we take out Offenbach and throw in like Rossini or something?
Yeah, let's do that. So now we've got Saint-Saëns, Strauss, and Rossini.
Okay.
Well, this is Felix Mendelssohn's Concertstück number 1 in F minor, opus 113 for clarinet and basset horn and orchestra.
Called it.
Oh, wow,
Hilarious.
Kensho, well done. Well, I think that's half a point. Just to Kensho
That's so not a
just
point.
for Kensho for saying basset horn. I'm very impressed by that, Kensho. That's great.
Mendelssohn. Aww. Okay. Well, good job.
Interesting.
That actually is fun.
Yeah.
Knowing that I know the composer actually is it makes it way more fun for me. Is despite my my reservation about it being more embarrassing than this.
I'm impressed by Jeremy's like unextinguishable like stamina for just continuing to send us stuff that we can feel bad about later.
Yes, I agree.
Today's second submission comes from listener Ian. Here it is. And I would like to give my episodely hint, which is that this is Juvenalia.
Okay. When it started, I thought it could be Scott Joplin, quite honestly. And when it finished, I thought it could be Edvard Grieg.
Definitely had like a folksy
Yes,
vibe.
folksy vibe, for sure. Juvenalia is interesting.
Yeah, what if it's like Bartok?
I thought Bartok, actually.
Juvenalia is tricky because, when people are very young, they're often writing to mimic a style of music that's maybe 20 or 30
A
years
generation?
old. Yeah, a generation older than they are.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, just on first listening, I would put this in like the 1880s, 1890s.
Mm-hmm.
So, maybe this is a composer writing further into the 20th century, like around 1920 or 30. It's kind of a guess.
I mean, the reason I ended up in Bartok was because it has a little bit of like slightly Eastern European flair to it. And maybe this is just in the performance of it, where there was like a yup-ba-da, there was a little bit of a inflection there of that rhythm and the articulation, which it's kind of things that make it into a performing edition that might not be written in the score.
Right. I also thought maybe it could be like Dvorak, but maybe not. Is that too obvious?
No. If this were Dvorak, but I mean, this would be like from...
Yeah, I'm kind of excluding the Juvenalia part.
Yeah,
of
exactly.
then,
It kind of doesn't
because-
account for Joey's giving us this
Yeah.
enormous hint here.
Yeah.
Right. Is Copeland too crazy?
Is Copeland too crazy? I mean, American is sort of... Because, like, if you guys are hearing little Eastern European overtones, like, don't forget, a lot of our American composers are from, like, Yiddish-speaking Eastern European Jewish families, like Copeland and Gershwin.
What about like Mahler?
Let's just throw out like the.
I'm trying to
normie.
think of like some, I mean, you mentioned
Yeah,
the
it's
Yiddish
not crazy,
connection,
yeah.
and I was thinking like, okay, somebody who, we would actually guess that would compose extreme, like the opposite of that, which would be dense. I mean, we have something that's
Right.
fairly transparent here. What if it's
Right.
somebody who like goes ham?
I'm not.
I love that.
Yeah, I kind of like that. Shall we say Mahler, Bartok, and Gershwin?
Okay.
Sure.
This is hilarious. I'm really enjoying this.
Well, this is the Intermezzo from Shostakovich's early piece, Minuet, Prelude, and Intermezzo, written when he was 14 years old.
Tiffany had us on the right track.
Yeah,
I think if
Eastern
we had
European.
like 5 more
Well
minutes, we would have done it.
No, we never would have figured this out.
All right. Today's last canonical composer submission comes from listener Kevin. Here it is.
There were like 5 seconds that sounded like Puccini, and I got kind of stuck on that. And then by the end, it sort of sounded like Bernard Herrmann or somebody.
Yeah, it was very movie, right?
Yeah, the whole excerpt was kind of film music, like.
I mean, it could be Korngold, but we're assuming that this is. I'm assuming that this is canonic classical, concert music composers,
Right.
and that's the feint here, is that it has kind of a movie-ish sound. But some very canonical classical composers wrote movie music. Definitely 20th. I mean, it has to be in the 20th century.
Yeah. I mean, it did have these kind of impressionisty vibes.
Mm-hmm.
Also had, I mean, we started off with more full orchestra, and then it went down to sounded like solo strings or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like something a little bit more.
Yeah, somebody was doing
sparse.
sophisticated orchestral, orchestration stuff here.
Right.
1920s, 30s, maybe teens.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Would you pinpoint a certain geographical area? I mean, I went back and forth between a lot of them. I could see it being American, certainly, but, again, like Golden Age movie, like we discussed, but I don't think that's where we are, just based on the fact that we're playing this game with this excerpt.
I could see this coming out of Vienna.
Like
Yeah,
Strauss
exactly.
or something.
That's kind of where I landed.
I mean, maybe this is somebody who, like, Second Viennese School. Berg or something.
Right. Yeah, it could be. It could be something like that. I mean, my big shocker one when I'm playing Name That Tune is always the opening of Gurrelieder by Schoenberg. And I don't think that this is Schoenberg. But I like your guys' thinking here. Berg? I don't know. Well, I think we should pick one of those Second Viennese composers and throw them into the mix.
Okay.
I like Berg.
I agree with you that I don't think it's Schoenberg. So, I mean, I think, Berg we know for quite a lot of, like, beautiful lyrical writing, actually. So,
yeah.
It doesn't not fit.
Okay, so Berg?
What about, like, I don't know, is it too soupy? Well, Respighi is a soupy composer, but could it be something like that?
That's not bad. Yeah, let's put that in there. I think we should pick an American.
Mm-hmm, okay.
But who is a canonic enough American to have
There's only like 4 of them,
this?
right?
Yeah,
Because like
exactly.
Bernstein, Copeland, Gershwin, Barber,
Yeah, and but I don't think it's any of them. I really don't. So maybe that's not a tree worth barking up.
Yeah.
What if we just said Puccini? I mean, this could be Puccini.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Here we are.
Berg, Respighi, and Puccini. Is it any of those
It's
three?
the weirdest.
I love these baskets.
Well, I guess our listeners are even more sneaky with these big names.
Oh,
The name
God.
was mentioned, though.
Oh.
This is a work by Lenny.
I almost took you back to that one.
Well,
I was this close.
Is it
I should
Bernstein?
say something.
Halil, a work for flute and chamber orchestra composed in 81.
Wow. This is from listener Kevin.
That's from listener Kevin, yes.
Well played, listener
don't reveal
Kevin.
any more details than that. Will's going to hunt this person down.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I really enjoy those.
This is good.
Yeah.
And the extra feint was that it's for flute and chamber orchestra, and
And-
I don't think there was any flute.
I
in
don't
that-
think so
in that
either.
excerpt.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. 0-3.
Yes. But very enjoyable.
Yeah.
That just about does it for this week's Prelude segment. But before we wrap up, we'd like to remind our listeners that we do periodic listener-generated Name That Tune rounds. So we invite you to try and stump us. Check our show notes where you'll find a link to the forum where you can upload a 30-second clip of an unidentified piece of classical music for us to try to identify.
Well, Joey, wish we could have done better for you, but here we are again. Thanks for joining us again, and I'm sure you'll be back to stump us even more. Tiffany, on to our first topic.
The New York Times reports, Anna von Haaswolf, an acclaimed Swedish songwriter and organist who performs original music across Europe, has faced recent pushback from conservative Roman Catholic groups on her concert tours. Among the objections, her songs were, quote, more a black mass than music for a church. She's been called the, quote, high priestess of satanic harmonies. On one of her tracks, the song Pills, she sings, I made love with the devil. Sounds kind of funny, but von Haaswolf has ended up having to move and even cancel shows when she appeared at her chosen venue, usually prominent churches for obvious reasons, and found it being picketed by groups of protesters up to 100 strong. This has been happening to her across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. While some priests have issued notes of support for her, others have had to cancel plans to host her after being deluged with complaints. While this obviously speaks to the larger point of culture wars, intensification across Europe and, frankly, here in the United States, which we'll get to, we at the GabFest thought would be an interesting lens into the relationship of performers with the venues they use. First, though, we have to clear up something. Does this music actually represent Satanism? Let's hear a clip.
Yeah, I'll drop in a clip here because I'm sure that our listeners are going to be very titillated by this setup. But I'll just note that this is not classical music, and in my opinion, it's not even very good non-classical music. So it's only going to be a few seconds.
So, as Will mentioned, this is not even classical music, but it does give us a sort of lens, right? Because this is not the first time, frankly, on this podcast that we've even discussed music and Satan. And what does that mean for our extremely rich history of music for church? Is there any merit to the fact that, oh, this is a house of worship and therefore we ought not bring music that has, well, giving them the benefit of the doubt and assuming that it even has satanic correspondence? Is there any ground to these objections? I mean, what is our responsibility in relationship with the venues we choose?
Well, I mean, to me, the responsibility is on the people who control the venues. And that's what I found interesting about this, is that, like, these churches obviously were okay. Like, they scheduled her, they let her rent out the space and use it. So it's just interesting to me that the kerfuffle is all due to, like, just people. It's not the church authorities, it's not the priests who are in charge, it's not the rectors or whatever. It's just like Orthodox religious people that don't want this, taking place inside this, quote unquote sacred space. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I mean, I'm somebody who performs in churches a lot, and I always feel like I have to sort of tiptoe around certain things. And, I know, like, a lot of my colleagues, especially in the world of choral music, who might have choral organizations that are very, like, social justice oriented, very based around promoting LGBT rights, for example, and then, like, go perform at a Catholic church. And I'm always sort of, curious about that, but the church allows it. And I sometimes tend to assume that the church authorities are going to be much more antithetical to that than they end up being. But I don't know. What do you guys think?
It's been a while since I rented out a church or anything like this. And I'm just trying to think back of when I used to do that for performances and thinking whether there was any kind of vetting system involved with that, or like an agreement, because obviously you sign some kind of contract or agreement with the venue that you're going to use the space for whatever, and there are rules and stuff like that. But I never imagined that any of the items would be like, please do not perform satanic music as one of the items. Is there?
Sometimes there will be a clause that's something like, you cannot do anything that promotes values that, our church does not agree with, for example.
I guess what I'm wondering is, for those of us who would like to achieve this degree of correspondence and mission in our lives, like where you only perform at venues that support what you're doing and that you only buy products that, you agree with ethically, like, I don't know, this feels like part of a larger question of, can we live our whole lives as artists or as even just people in this kind of alignment? It feels so modern to me. I mean, that is the aspect of this question that feels like very much part of our age and not just like one more example of people being bigoted or whatever it is.
I think that it reveals a certain privilege to be able to do it. To live your life in a bubble in such a way that you would never butt up against people who have differing opinions from you. Mm-hmm. So, for example, like my organization, we perform in a church that frankly has quite retrograde views. This is not even a Catholic church, but it's the evangelical side of a mainline Protestant denomination. It's sort of a sect. And there are a lot of people on my board who would very much prefer us not to perform there because they think that it alienates some of our potential customers, some of our audience members, people who we would like to be part of our community. Even though, they don't lay down any strictures about, you have to promote whatever traditional family values or anything like that. I mean, we can pretty much do what we want to in there. Right. But, here's the thing. We could do our full concert series downtown at Benaroya Hall in Seattle instead. It would just cost 5 times as much. Right. So, I mean, that's why I'm saying it would be sort of a privileged approach for us to be able to do that. We're able to do as much concertizing as we do because we perform at this venue, which gives us we're grandfathered into a pretty low expense. Mm-hmm. But, there is this psychological friction for many of us in performing in that particular location.
Yeah. Well, Will, I mean, and I ask this not because I am trying to push back against you at all, but because I also think of you as one of the people in my life who is pretty good at incorporating your personal choices into your ethics and the way you live. Mm-hmm. What if the argument, which I'm sure some people in your organization have put forth, is wouldn't it be easy to find another church these days in, Metro Seattle that doesn't support these retrograde views? What is the kind of mental framework with which you answer that question?
Well, my framework is that, quite frankly, I would be very happy for us to perform someplace else. It really just, in this particular case, comes down to logistics because we're a chorus and an orchestra, we take up a lot of stage room, and it's actually very hard to find a performing space that has decent enough acoustics, that has a large enough stage, large enough audience, the whole thing. Mm-hmm. I was actually quoted in an article in one of the main choral journals. I can link that in our show notes. But there are, all throughout the country, there are a lot of civically minded choruses that are like community choruses or professional choruses that are not affiliated religiously, who would much rather be performing at different kinds of venues if they could have the support of acoustics.
My kind of touch point with this, I think, is maybe when I was younger, when I was playing random gigs on the violin, and mostly they were for church services that I had no idea what was going on. I always felt very weird about the fact that, yes, I was there to play music, which is what I was trained to do, and it was good extra money. But then I would show up to this place and look, and watch these, I played many Christmas Eve masses and all this, and watching the proceedings and all of this, and I'm like, it's a completely different world that you step into, and yet it's still the same skills that you're putting to the test, let's say, in terms of how you're performing and playing the violin and all this. So it's funny that this conversation has put me at that point of reflection, let's say, in terms of there is a different message that you send to your audience, not even just someone that's showing up playing the gig, but to your audience of where you're holding your concerts in terms of how comfortable they may be just with how they how you present yourself in a space.
Well, let me ask this, because there is such a vogue for quote-unquote non-traditional performing venues. I mean, that's all the rage, right? I mean, and that usually means bars. Have you guys done any stuff at non-traditional performing venues? What do you think of those?
To expand your response to, the ease or not of finding alternative spaces, it just becomes a huge logistics issue. Non-traditional venues include incredible amounts of overhead in terms of just planning, even maybe especially in a bar or restaurant. I mean, but what if the chairs have arms on them? Even something as silly as that all of a sudden becomes a major headache. Transporting stands, not a small deal. we have spaces, and fortunately, ones that got created, by which I mean concert halls, ones that got created as secular life in mostly, Western Europe was increasingly voluminous, right? And the highlighting of that in our literature reflects that. In fact, this is essentially a big part of the story that I tell my history 101 students, is like the history of our kind of music is essentially the history of where it was performed, and the associations of where it gets performed is a big part of what we tend to respect in our industry as well. Like if you've made it to the concert hall, no matter how many non-traditional venues you've performed at, making it to the concert hall is still a big deal. But it is an interesting question, and especially for somebody like Anna von Haaswolf, who is obviously like a not classical, not Christian, and I mean she just needs an instrument. And where are you finding organs in secular spaces? Like, are there even any, hardly?
Well, that's the thing. Like, the organ is such specifically like an instrument of the church. Like, where else is she gonna go besides a big concert hall?
They used to have them in department stores, and there's still a few that have those historical ones.
Yeah,
I think
the
that there's
Macy's
actually
in Philly.
Yeah, right. I was gonna say Philadelphia has a very famous Macy's. I think it's a Skinner.
Oh yeah.
That's the other irony about the organ, is that like it is like the church instrument par excellence, and maybe because of those associations, nothing sounds more demonic and like devilish. It's like the perfect thing to sound that way. So
people are protesting this, and they're not protesting the John Cage organ piece. I mean, that's the true like crime here. Like they should go and surround that church that's playing the interminable
right.
John Cage piece.
Oh, way to bring it back, Kensho. Yeah, CGF number 2. Love it.
Yeah, never forget.
All right. Well, let's see what happens. But interesting points here about artists and venues. Let's go on to our second topic of the day, Will.
Okay, GabFest listeners, every week you listen to us ramble on about classical topics of the day, and now it's time for us to listen to you. Thanks again to everyone who's written in, and please, listeners, if you have feedback for us, whether it's something we got right, something we got wrong, topic or guest suggestions, or anything else, please email them to us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com or find us on social media. All right, Kensho, why don't you cue up our first bit of listener feedback here?
All right. Well, I'm assuming this is coming from our favorite listener Jeremy.
It
is.
He
writes, just listened to the Frankfurt Rundfunks concert. This is back on episode 72. I think I'm mostly in camp with Tiffany and Kensho on this one. The Lohengrin, not Parsifal, overture left me cold. Did somebody say Parsifal?
I said it was Parsifal, and I talked about it extensensively.
You being called
so
out.
So that was the first
right.
thing. Well, and actually, I issued a correction on our Twitter channel that we had that I had misspoken. So that is the first thing to acknowledge in this email.
Yes, of course. And he continues, the Goodbye to Lena was boring to distraction for me, in parentheses, but that's not a surprise as I've never gotten much from her work. And the Mahler seemed serviceable. I did love the Westhoff encore, and in general have found myself enjoying a soloist encore more than the concerto they're there to perform.
Well, I'll just say this. After your guys' response to that concert, when I was editing in the selections into our discussion, I did find myself enjoying it quite a bit less. So,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, this is the trouble with music criticism.
Bravo to you guys. Made my world a less enjoyable place.
Aww.
Anyway, going on.
From listener Claire, listening to the Gabfest episode about the violin scammers, episode 68 on December 16th, and I feel so affirmed and seen because they were at the east entrance of the Greenwood Fred Meyer all summer, and I wasn't disturbed, but found it all very odd.
Interesting. Well, if other listeners have seen the violin scams continuing, we'd love to know about it, especially now that your ears are peaked.
Yeah, what I want to know is,
looking out
did you
for it.
learn anything from our segment that would enable you to definitively say that they were faking?
That's right. Tiffany had laid out like some pretty, strict criteria. Of
Yeah,
how
we
to
really try and
discern.
make this podcast educational.
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly.
That's our main goal here.
All right, this next listener feedback comes from listener Chuck, who has written us before, so he writes, hello again. I just wanted to share my 2 cents on the Sphinx grant given to the New York Phil/Juilliard as a middle and high school orchestra director. So Chuck is a middle and high school orchestra director, and he is referring to our discussion on Gabfest episode number 64 in November of the past year. I am incredibly excited to see what pieces come from this program. I have made a concerted effort in the past few years to program music primarily by underrepresented composers, i.e. composers of color, female composers, non-binary composers, etc. Though I have some talented students, we primarily play music written for school ensembles. It is incredibly difficult to find music written for intermediate ensembles by underrepresented composers. Most of the up-and-coming composers that fall into this category are writing for professional or college ensembles. I am hopeful that this grant yields some more options for the intermediate school orchestras. Though her music is great for student groups to play, there's only so many times you can program works by Soon-Hee Newbold. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to agree completely on this one. I mean, I also conduct a group that has to stick mostly to arrangements of quote unquote real repertoire or music that was written expressly for that. And it's like, it's hard to navigate that space. I mean, as a publishing space, it's a completely different beast, first of all.
Right.
But like, can we also talk about the fact that like so much of wow, I don't really want to put composers on blast here, but like their music is so hard. Like music by a lot of the composers right now, like you're looking at it like, okay, if we're talking about ease of getting into this space, I recognize that it's good that these composers are getting performed by top orchestras for whom you do not have to account for the fact that I don't know, the second string wind players might be there or that and so on. But it's really challenging.
This is a great point though, because I think it's not necessarily like an expectation of composers that are writing for professional ensembles to be able to write for that level as well, because it does take a skill to do that,
That's
to
exactly
understand the limitations of people that are learning to play their instruments and being able to write according to that.
Yeah, good point, Kensho. All right, why don't you take us to our next bit of listener feedback here?
Great. This comes from listener Bruce, and he writes, I am a faithful listener of your podcast. I look forward to each episode. Thank you, Bruce. I was intrigued by the comment that Tiffany made in the latest one, which was back in episode 63 in November, that she feels that there is a lack of inspirational conductors. I know you probably wouldn't want to discuss who you don't find inspirational, but I wonder if you could talk about who you do. I am not a musician, so it is hard for me to judge. I am a subscriber to the Philadelphia Orchestra, so I see Yannick conduct often. I enjoy it when he conducts. Since he has been a mentor to Kensho, I would think Kensho would find him inspirational.
Yeah, Bruce, clearly you've been listening to the podcast since Kensho tends to drop his name on every single episode, if not every segment. So good listening there.
That is definitely not true. I did attend a New York Phil concert a few years ago where Andras Schiff conducted from the keyboard with a Schumann piano concerto and conducted a Haydn symphony. It was pretty blah.
Okay, let me put like a pretty big asterisk. So Will, you just admitted that based on Kensho and my cold reaction to the concert that you enjoyed seeing, that your subsequent enjoyment of the experience declined. And I am hesitant to talk about, and the listener Bruce acknowledges this, to talk about conductors that I don't find inspiring for exactly the same reason. I'm not necessarily trying to get out there and say, this is not good because X, Y, and Z, so that other people can, quote unquote, judge, right?
Right.
So then it's like, okay, well, who do we find inspirational? And I'm pretty sure we mentioned Yannick by name after I made this statement as one of the exceptions. But as for who I really like to see right now out there, gosh.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. It's sad. It's a sad state. And it's not because I'm not sure what the answer is. I mean, like, obviously part of that is my own baggage and like approaching concerts, and feeling some measure of dissatisfaction with where I am in my career, and then kind of frustrations with things that I have seen as I work towards goals in my career that I then don't see as borne out in the field, right? I mean, we'd like to feel like our field has justice in it, and it just doesn't. So I'm afraid I can't really provide a good answer to this, despite Will's having given me a heads up that we were going to be answering this very question.
Sorry to hear that, Tiffany.
Yeah.
I have a few. And there are many. I could name others. One who I like a lot is Vladimir Yurovsky, who was the music director of the London Philharmonic for a while. And, I don't know that much about him as an interpreter. What I do know is that I love his selection of repertoire because he is a big Schnicke-phile, as am I. So I like that I find that inspiring, that he programs so much Schnicke.
He has a recording of Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme Strauss on YouTube that I really actually do enjoy a lot.
Oh, Good. Okay. Another one that I would put on my list, basically from the, I've known about her work before, but from the segment about the Grammys that we did, and we listened to her recording of the Bartók Bluebeard's Castle, was Susanna Malki. And I would put money down that she is going to wind up at the helm of, if not the New York Philharmonic, then one of the other major American orchestras that is currently looking for a music director, if they can get her. And, I was just so taken away. I've listened to some of her other Bartók recordings on the BIS label that are part of this series, and I think they're fantastic. So I would put her on there. And then another is a conductor who conducted in Cincinnati a bunch when I was there, a Spaniard named Juanjo Mena, who has a wide repertoire, introduced me to a lot of interesting works that I hadn't known before. I just always felt that he was very in control, very loose guy, very musical, knew a lot. And so, and he was one of the very few conductors that ever came through Cincinnati who in any way showed interest in what I was doing and wanted to give me, pointers or take me under the wing at all. So yeah, I like Juanjo a lot too. Kensho, any others besides Yannick?
I was thinking about Esa-Pekka Salonen as someone that I also really find inspirational when he's on the podium. His music is hit or miss for me. I don't love all of the stuff that he writes, but as a conductor, there was a particular performance of Also Sprach that he did with Philly that it still remains in my mind. I kind of find when we're talking about inspirational conductors, if I haven't seen them live in the concert hall, I kind of feel like I shouldn't. It's a different thing to kind of see them in person interacting with an orchestra than watching a movie or a concert recording. So in that effect, kind of it's all the people that kind of came through Philly. Another one that comes to mind in a very different way is Emmanuel Hayim. Do you know her?
Oh, yeah, of course.
She's a Baroque specialist and very unique way of communicating all of her ideas. And she brings all of her own markings to every part, even changes instrumentation depending on the repeat of something, and it's very hands-on micromanaging, which of course a lot of professional orchestras don't love, but I think just the way that the knowledge behind everything that she was doing was actually quite incredible.
And a lot of creativity, I would say. She comes from that early music performance practice, mindset of let's futz around with it and have fun.
Yeah. So, those two come to mind in terms of people that I've seen in person and I've actually interacted with as well. So yeah, it's not just Yannick, guys. Come on.
Yeah, but it's mostly Yannick, let's be honest.
Fair.
All right, Tiff, why don't you do our next bit of listener feedback? This is a very fun one.
Oh, this is amazing. I'll read it in parts so that we can react because it's a long one. This is from listener Gabe. He writes, Dear Classical Gabfest, I thoroughly enjoyed your discussion of play conducting and whether, as was so eloquently queried, it is, quote, a thing. This is on our episode number 63 back in November. It just so happens that I listened to the episode literally 2 hours before play conducting, and of course this is the activity that we discussed of where there is an orchestral soloist who also conducts the orchestra at the same time as performing their concerto of choice, before play conducting Brandenburg 4 as solo violinist. Your discussion made me lose all confidence in the effectiveness of what I was doing, and I tanked the performance. Thanks for that. I should mention that I conducted the rest of the program, but thought it might be interesting to share what I experienced to be my most important responsibilities as a soloist conductor, specifically as pertains to the genre of Baroque concerti. Allow me to share these responsibilities in the form of a how-to guide. You guys ready?
Yes.
Let's have it.
Step 1. Go to the orchestra library, find the set of parts for the piece with all of the previous performances' bowings and penciled in dynamic adjustments. Step 2. Burn the parts so that they can't hurt anyone ever again.
Yeah, exactly.
As per your conversation about the efficiency and the time is money reality of rehearsals, I've seen it often with Baroque concert cycles, the dreaded question from third stand inside player of the viola section. We have a penciled in drop to mezzo piano in measure 243 followed by a crescendo. Do you want us to do that? And then someone in the second violin says, "Oh, in our part it says mezzo forte there."
Oh my god!
Yeah, oh my god! This is so. This is traumatic, traumatically real life.
This is when I run out of the room screaming.
And let me tell you something. It's even worse in the world of choirs, where you get back apart and be like, "I have that we're supposed to take a breath, an eighth note here. Should that be a 16th note or a quarter note? And I have that this word we changed, from below." Oh my god! It never ends. It's the worst.
Step 3. Print out new blank parts from IMSLP. Mark them with the exact matching bowings and phrasing dynamics that you want, and photocopy the parts for the musicians so that they can't be questioned or smudged.
I'm a huge believer in photocopying your bowings into the parts. Let me just say that
Mess
right
with
away.
them, yeah.
Wow. This is a level of like control.
Yeah,
that
I know,
not experienced
exactly.
yet. Okay.
Yeah.
Step 4. Before the first run-through, demonstrate the recurring musical motifs for the orchestra, ostensibly for the sake of unity, but really just to impress. This figure should sound like this. Demonstrate. And this other figure should always sound like this. Demonstrate. Hopefully you sounded good in the demonstrations. If not, the week is a bust. Better luck next time. Step 5. Run the piece and be emotionally prepared for everything to be too heavy and slow down. Step 6. Ask everyone to play with more lightness and not to slow down. This is so real. Step 7. Try again and accept that each successive performance will get heavier and slower. And that's really all there is to it. Congratulations. You're a regular Apollo's Fire. Get ready to cash some big checks.
Amazing. Totally amazing. That is fantastic. All right. Well, for our last bit of listener feedback, I actually have an audio excerpt here. This comes from listener Erica. See if you guys recognize this particular sound.
It was making better notes at home.
That's what we all say at rehearsal.
Yes, exactly. Well, yeah, the unmistakable scratching of
The U-gears
nails on a
hurdy-gurdy.
chalkboard. It is, in fact, the U-gears hurdy-gurdy. Listener, I mean, boy, what better bit of listener feedback could there be than that? Listener Erica, inspired by our show, got and put together the U-gears hurdy-gurdy. Listener Erica is a friend of mine, so I recorded that at a rehearsal of ours, and it was very cool. I was so glad that I got to see it in person. I got to push the little buttons and stuff. It was very neat.
Well, and presumably Erica did not break the tuning peg at the very moment she was stringing up the instrument, which, if you will recall, I did, which rendered my instrument damn near unusable.
No, as you can hear from that demonstration, this is a very usable instrument. I'm sure it's going to be played in concerts and all sorts of non-traditional performance venues.
I hope Erica had a good time putting it together.
Yeah, I think she had a great time. I mean, she even sent us some pictures along the way with questions that Tiffany weighed in on, which is great.
It is really fun. I mean, all the U-gear stuff is fun. I don't think there are that many musical instruments, but there are some other really fun ones.
Excellent. Well, thank you again so much, listeners. If you have feedback, once again, find us on social media or YouTube. A lot of people like commenting there or emailing us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com. And with that, it's time for our final topic, Kensho.
Antonio Salieri poisoned Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. This bit of gossip from Paris in 1824 will be familiar to anyone who's seen the movie Amadeus, but it had purchase throughout the 19th century, even reaching the ears of other well-known composers such as Gioacchino Rossini, Richard Wagner, and Ludwig van Beethoven. This bit of gossip, and the role of historical gossip in particular, is a topic of a recent article in Contingent magazine by Dr. Kristin M. Francine. Dr. Francine looks at the Salieri story and how it has influenced our reception of Mozart's music and the ways we can contextualize historical rumor and hearsay. Dr. Francine is a postdoctoral researcher in history and a research associate of the Simone de Beauvoir Institute at Concordia University, where her work is supported by the Fonds de Recherche de Québec, Société et Culture. We're delighted to have Dr. Francine join us this week. Welcome, Kristin.
Oh, thank you.
Well, to start off, can you give us maybe your entry point into Salieri and his music and why you've maybe happened upon this rumor and kind of unraveled it for all of us?
Probably my first encounter with the rumor was probably in middle or high school as an orchestra nerd reading some kind of music appreciation book. And I remember very clearly in the section on the magic flute, it said something along the lines of, oh, and even Antonio Salieri enjoyed magic flute, which famously he did. However, as far as I remember, there was nothing else in the book explaining who Salieri was or why that would be shocking to readers. So I sort of went forth and read and watched Amadeus, of course, and wound up writing my master's thesis on one of Salieri's operas, La Grotta di Trofogno. What I find interesting about a lot of the ways musicologists in the last 40 some years have responded to Amadeus is there tends to be a lot of factual debunking and a lot of emphasis on, oh, of course, no one ever really believed this. And I'm more interested as someone who works on the history of gossip and anecdote, not so much in whether or not it was believed, but how it was told in different contexts and how different people reacted to it in different times and places.
Okay, there's so many interesting threads to pick apart here, but before I get to my questions, pertaining to this particular topic, I don't get to meet many people who know a lot about Antonio Salieri very much, and I have always felt that I should know more about Salieri, that I should be familiar with some of his music. I don't want to scoop your mixtape suggestion here, but can you just give us the briefest summary, who is Salieri? Should we like him? Is he underappreciated now? Should we hear more of his actual music? Just tell us a little bit about Salieri.
Salieri lived pretty much exactly the classical era. He was born in 1750 and died in 1825. He moved to Vienna when he was 16.
So he was only 6 years older than Mozart then.
Yes. Yeah, no, a lot of the sort of fictions make it seem like he was much older.
Well, and I guess partially that's because he outlived Mozart by so long that you can see him as an old man, but you can never see Mozart as an old man.
This is true. Although there's actually a really fun, the late mystery novelist Robert Barnard wrote a couple of alternate history mystery novels where Mozart is an old man living in London, writing kind of hack theater pieces and complaining about the state of the world.
Whoa. Okay, that's our next book club right there. Robert Barnard, is that what you said this guy's name is?
And the first book is called Dead Mr. Mozart. So he wrote somewhere between 38 and 40 operas in Italian, German, and French, some of them in multiple languages. And also in the early 19th century, as he sort of left behind his theater career, became well known as a teacher. He taught Beethoven and Schubert and very briefly Liszt for a time.
That's so crazy.
And as far as I definitely would like to hear more of his operas out there. And I especially, and maybe this will pertain to my classical mixtape suggestion, but I would especially like to hear more of his comic operas, because I think the image you get in Amadeus and in Pushkin's play, Mozart and Salieri, that Rimsky-Korsakov set, you get this image of him as very serious, in particular, very serious about music, but almost all of the operas he wrote for Vienna were opera buffa.
Okay, so your article focuses on the power of gossip, or the power of the empty archives, this quote that you cite to Jenny Rice. And is there something about characters like Salieri or William Shakespeare, whom you also discuss a little bit of, this kind of people whom mythologies arise around? Why? Why these people? Is it just that, we don't know much about what happened in this point, and, Salieri is an interesting foil to Mozart, who got the better end of the stick? Or is there something that we can learn from the fact that there is this big old hunk of hooey, that surrounds these people's lives?
Part of it is that, history, real history as it happened, and real people in the world don't make a whole lot of sense. I mean, we see this now in the world, in real life and on social media, and that real people, do things that are inconsistent with how we think they should respond to things. Their lives don't make sense the way a novel or a play sort of makes sense with a very clear plot line. Like, for example, with Shakespeare, a lot of the mythologizing and the conspiracy theories that have grown up around Shakespeare are really sort of 19th and 20th and 21st century frustration with things about the Elizabethan era that to later audiences don't make sense. And I think there's a similar kind of thing going on with Salieri, in that a lot of the fictional depictions you see, not just in Amadeus, although that's the most famous, really draw out these sorts of themes of artistic jealousy and historical legacy that really weren't how people thought about being composers in the 1780s and 90s. They were barely how people thought about being composers in the 1820s. One of the more interesting things I've read in a couple of different biographies of Salieri is this idea that, like, yeah, probably in the 18 teens and 20s, Salieri did grow to be kind of annoyed that people kept bringing up Mozart around him, because he was in his 60s and 70s and had done all of these other interesting things. And, you know, the sort of period in his life when he was competing with Mozart over Italian language opera commissions was really only a fairly small part of it. There's a lot of kind of projection of emotions that maybe we today feel or think that people should have felt back onto some of these figures in the past.
You mentioned in your article one of these farcical anecdotes by Edmund Michot, the La Visite de Wagner and Rossini. So Wagner and Rossini supposedly discussing these rumors. Can you tell us about this account and, again, this kind of interesting rumor that kind of reaches the ears of all these composers that we all know?
Yeah, I love this story. And I have several friends here in Montreal who are experts on French music journalism in the 19th and early 20th century. And I've kind of tried to gauge, like, did this meeting even really happen? Because as I mentioned, Michaud's account was published, something like 40 or 50 years after this meeting supposedly took place. And he's writing down like dialogue between Wagner and Rossini. But basically what happens is Rossini and Wagner are having this conversation in 1860 about all of the annoying things that can happen when you're trying to put on an opera. The singers and the managers and the censors and other composers and, you know, everything that gets in the way. And they get into this conversation first about Carl Maria von Weber and the various intrigues he was supposedly involved with, and then about Viennese life in the early 19th century in general. And then they turn to talking about Beethoven. And Rossini mentions all of the hoops he had to jump through to meet Beethoven. And he mentions that first he tried to talk to Beethoven through talking with Salieri, who of course was one of Beethoven's teachers. So then the conversation turns to, oh, well, you might remember that there was this rumor that Salieri may have poisoned Mozart. And Wagner says, yes, I've heard that too, you know, years later. And then Rossini claims to have like brought up this rumor to Salieri's face and kind of joked about it in the 1820s, which, given the reports that were coming in various musical journals about Salieri's health at that point, seems incredibly mean. But Rossini reports it as kind of, I brought up to Salieri that, you know, well, it's a good thing Beethoven doesn't go out anymore, because otherwise you might try to dispatch him the way you dispatched Mozart. And according to Michaud, according to Rossini, several layers of gossip there, Salieri responded, oh, so I seem like a murderer to you. And Rossini supposedly responded, no, you seem like, pardon my language, you seem a little bit like an asshole. And then the conversation goes on to talk about other people and things and more recent music. But it's just fascinating to me that even if this whole conversation is completely fictional and it's just Edmund Michaud trying to cash in on the fact that he knew Wagner and Rossini, and even though everyone involved in this conversation makes it clear they don't believe the rumor as fact, there's still this fascination with it. And there's still this like, oh, I know kind of what was going on in musical circles because I've heard this thing.
That's something I really wanted to get into. This is a quote from your article. You say, while it is clear that neither Rossini nor Wagner, at least in Michaud's account, took the rumor seriously as historical fact, the rumor had real currency as a rumor, a way to showcase one's musical knowledge and connections. Now, just to take this on a little bit more contemporary and a little bit more serious angle, you know, we have all of these revelations that come to light. And then it turns out that these were open secrets. Like, for example, we on this show, we never did a full segment about James Levine because oftentimes Kensho and I will bring to the topic conversation a bunch of things that are sort of about gossip. And Tiffany will say, no, we're not salacious, rumor mill here, much to her credit, because she's like a responsible human being. So when we were thinking about James Levine, I thought a lot about my history of knowing about allegations against James Levine of sexual impropriety. And so then, he dies, and then it all comes out. It had come out before he died, I guess, but, comes out in sort of grand fashion. And everybody's saying like, wow, this was an open secret. How did nothing ever happen? It was an open secret. And I just think about when I was in college, I was like 20, 21 years old, and my teacher first told me these gossip secrets about James Levine. And it was like currency. It made me feel very special and very adult and very insider to know these things. And then I felt that I had that currency now to spend to elevate my own social capital within the world of music and musicians. So it's like reading that sentence in your article really concretized for me, how do these open secrets remain? It's because the community is using these quote unquote secrets as ways to elevate themselves and to promote themselves and give themselves additional social capital. So I really do want to thank you for kind of pointing that out. And it just sort of sunk into me at a contemporaneous level with my own life. I more of a comment than a question. I don't know if you want to respond to that at all.
Yeah, in both music and in academia, when accusations of sexual harassment or other forms of kind of professional abuse come out, and oftentimes there'll be some conversation about whisper network, people who were protecting each other by sharing what they had knew or what they suspected or had heard. And I remember reading something kind of in response to that said that the thing about whisper networks is that they only work when the powers that be aren't doing anything. Mm-hmm. That when people kind of have to protect themselves in these sorts of, I guess, kind of gossipy ways by sharing this information. And I think it's really interesting that you bring up the open secret as almost a facet of that, right? That it's not just people trying to protect themselves from an abusive situation. It's also that like you're in this industry and you know something about this powerful person that, let's say, maybe the audience doesn't. It's mm-hmm. disturbing.
Well, I so completely see what you mean by saying that the whisper network only works when those who have the potential to do something about the situation aren't doing anything. Because, of course, we'll very, thoughtfully describe me as the person who will like quash any leanings of this podcast to go into the gossip network. And it's not that I don't also have fun like knowing these things, right? I mean, on some level, on a more harmless level, such as the one that we started this conversation out with, and that is because Salieri is many generations removed, and not because what we're talking about is any less damaging. It's not that I find that stuff any less fun to talk about than other folks, but if knowledge of this kind stands as currency in our world, then I feel like the way that responsible civic members, just generally the public, can help put a damper on it is to stop accepting the currency. And so I don't accept the currency of gossip much anymore. In fact, when somebody says, ooh, I try and first of all see it from the perspective of the person whom we're gossiping about and how that might have looked. And then I generally don't even feel like listening to things that I know aren't my business necessarily. But that is because I would hope that if the person in power who had something to do with this piece of gossip, which usually I don't, heard it, then they would have incentive and means and power to do something about it. So I so completely see what you mean about that needing to be a piece of the puzzle in order for this kind of civic moderation of the gossip train to happen. That's just my thought. Also more of a comment than a question.
There's so much to know about Salieri. I'm actually really fascinated and interested to learn more. Thank you so much, Kristin, for joining us and explaining some of this from us. And I think we got into some interesting discussions of how this all applies to how we perceive artists and composers today. Before we let you go, would you be willing to stick around and recommend something to our listeners for our classical mixtape segment?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
In our classical mixtape, we each recommend some music that's caught our ear this week to share with our listeners. So, Kristin, what would you like to share with our listeners today?
I would like to share Signor, poeta mio, which is the opening duet of Salieri's Prima la musica e poi le parole, first the music and then the words. It's a really great duet for bass voices. And as I mentioned earlier, people tend to think of Salieri as very serious, and this is very comic, and it's also making fun of opera and like all of the bureaucracy and money and stress that goes into making a new opera. So in this duet, we'll hear a poet and a composer who have 4 days to finish an opera. And the poet is kind of suffering from writer's block. And the composer says, oh, don't worry, I've already written all the music. You just need to write some words and it'll be fine. And so they sort of argue back and forth about this. And then eventually the singers start showing up to audition.
In 4 dì è impossibile, arcipossibile. In 4 dì e deve andar così. Con maestri ostinati, con poeti sguaiati, io per me divento matto. Nulla credo dove il fatto se non fassi a modo lor. Nulla credo dove il fatto se non fassi a modo lor. Vorrei prego l'orror, meglio farmi un pulcinetto. Vorrei prego l'orror, questo è cominciarla. Che grande asino ch'io fui, che grande asino ch'io fui. Anco far come con lui, che il fe compositor, vorrei prego l'orror.
Great. I'm very excited now that our mixtape has a Salieri representation on it. So thank you for being with us today, Kristin.
Oh, no worries. Thank you.
Let's go to Will next.
All right, well, my recommendation this week, it's one of these apropos of nothings. This is a piece that I stumbled on by a composer I had never heard of, and it's a bit of comedy in music, which I usually find totally unfunny, especially when it's written by a contemporary composer. Like, I just think that, generally speaking, that it doesn't work or exist. But this I found really funny. This is a sort of a monodrama song/scene. It's about 10 minutes long. It's for mezzo-soprano and piano. And it's by a composer named Rachel Peters. And it's called Ethel Smyth Plays Golf in Limbo. So it's about the composer from the early 20th century, Dame Ethel Smyth, who was a groundbreaking, trailblazing composer, had to put up with all sorts of terrible sexism and misogyny in the world of classical music at this point, but she loved playing golf. And in this little scene, it's after she's dead, she's in limbo, and she's talking about all of the bullshit that she had to put up with male critics and composers and performers, not wanting to do her music. And now she gets to like trundle around the golf course, just enjoying herself. So it's great fun and I think a very delightful piece of music. I would encourage the composer to orchestrate it. I would love to do it here with my group. So this is Ethel Smyth Plays Golf in Limbo, performed by Jennifer Beattie and Adam Marks.
Finally, the links all to myself, and all I had to do was die. Years upon years of sneaking through the men's club onto their exclusive course. Now they've got that LPGA. Wouldn't I like to be a part of that? I never missed a single shot, not with a trusty sheepdog as my caddy. Good boy, Pan, 2 and Pan 3. Good boys, Pans 4 through 7.
All right, next recommendation, Kensho.
All right, so it's been a while since I've recommended something from Quatuor Ben, so here we are again with your daily or weekly or monthly dose of my favorite quartet. This is from the same album as the Transfigured Night that I recommended, which was kind of curiously titled like Midnight or something like that, some like weird one-word album title. So this is another selection from that album. This is a piece by Raphaël Merlin called Night Bridge, and this is the sixth movement called On Night and Day.
Okay, and to round out our mixtape for today, I stumbled upon this. Actually, I was doing my prep for subbing in an orchestra concert for a different timpani concerto, but I kind of came across this in my listening and found it a little bit more compelling. So this is Philip Glass's Concerto Fantasy for two timpanists and orchestra.
Tiffany, this is, maybe you don't realize this, but this was a Name That Tune that we had.
Oh yes, now I remember.
Oh yeah, right.
Exactly.
So I mean, I feel like the pickings out there for timpani concertos are pretty slim, because it's like, it can play notes, but it's not a very melodic instrument. But here, it does its job in that fashion, I think.
Ringing endorsement.
Yeah. It's fun, we'll say this. You'll find the links to all these and to our full classical mixtape playlist in the show notes.
And with that, it's time to wrap up this episode of the Classical Gabfest. I'm William White, and on behalf of Tiffany Liu and Kensho Watanabe, I'd like to thank you so much for listening and to encourage you to subscribe and rate us on your podcast app. We'd also love your help spreading the word about the show on social media, where you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can reach us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, happy listening, and we'll be with you next week.